Well, we're now joined by geologist Professor Ian Plimer, live here in the studio. Ian, great to have you here as always. Tell me about that tie of yours. It's caught my eye and the viewers will want to know the full story. There, I've set you an opening here.
It's a Mar-a-Lago club tie. I've been to Mar-a-Lago a couple of times and I wear this tie on important occasions. Today's the exception,
Absolutely.
of course.
And you were most recently there for the inauguration?
I was in Washington for the inauguration. It started with a rally. It was a pretty cold night. And it was interesting to see the profile of the people. These were disenfranchised people. These were people who were suffering from the high electricity costs, from unemployment, from basically a deluded leader. And these people really are getting supported by a leader called Trump. And he's a phenomenon. We will not see the likes of another Trump again in our lives.
I agree.
An absolute phenomenon. And he does something which our politicians could learn from. He makes a promise and he actually sticks to it.
Yeah.
Now, that's really unusual. And we're all here waiting for our $275. That was a promise made to us. No one's got that money. So Trump is just bulldozing through policy which people knew he was going to do. Now, at his rallies, these were incredible. Warmed up by people like Elon Musk, Megyn Kelly, who viewers would know as a regular on Paul Murray Live. It was absolutely phenomenal. And here's a man that can have the crowd eating out of his hand. And he does something very unusual. He speaks the truth. And people actually like that.
Now, he's promised, or he's already pulled out of the Paris Agreement. He's abandoned net zero. What can the coalition learn from Donald Trump, Ian?
Well, they can learn an enormous amount. The US, China, India, they're not in Paris. We once had the cheapest, most reliable energy systems in the world. We had coal giving us very cheap power in Victoria, a little bit more expensive in New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia and South Australia, but we had cheap power. We have lost that because people have followed an ideological path. And this ideological path allegedly is underpinned by science. Now, if you follow the science, there is no science that demonstrates that human emissions drive global warming. So why are we doing it? So we're seeing countries like Germany and the UK go out backwards because they're following this renewables path. Trump has used something that's very, very rare. It's called common sense and is going down the path of saying, we have cheap coal, we have plenty of oil, not much uranium in the US, but they import it from Canada. And the US has only following the cheapest path for energy. That leads to a big manufacturing industry. We have no manufacturing industry now in this country because we've destroyed our energy system. So Mr. Dutton has to think very carefully about Paris. He actually has to think very carefully about the farms we are destroying with solar panels and wind turbines and power lines going across them. And James has had his hand up 4 times. Yes, the boy at the back.
Well, I'm going to ask you about this here because I want your opinion on, what should Peter Dutton then be saying? Because he has said in the past he's going to stick around in Paris because, we're in it, it is too hard to change or whatever. Yet, what I'm really interested in, I don't know geology, but I do know something about economics and business. BP has said we are retreating from net zero. Macquarie Bank and all of these banks around the world are all saying we are pulling back from net zero. We are going to invest in fossil projects again because that's where the money is. And if we don't have energy, we're not going to have economies. Why do you think the coalition seems to be trying to garner votes in these sort of inner city seats where they still care about Paris when it's out in the regions that people are saying, no, we've got to get out of this because it is destroying our communities, it's destroying our economy, it's destroying our future?
Well, Rita touched on it in her editorial. The Parliamentary Liberal Party has wets. They're in the Senate and they're in the lower house. And it's very hard for the leader sometimes to lead on matters of principle, which are going to be for the benefit of the country, when you've got wets who are in the wrong party. Mr. Dutton should lead. He should say, as a matter of principle, we want people to have cheap electricity in this country. We don't want these jaw-dropping electricity bills that people are getting because of renewables. We want to have energy supporting industry and creating jobs, and he has to lead. And if he doesn't want to lead, he can then say, well, we have the biggest economy in the world that's dropping net zero. We have growing economies like China and India that are not having net zero. China's building coal-fired power stations like they're going out of fashion. We need to rebuild coal-fired power stations. We need to have nuclear. We need to have a huge amount of baseload power with peak load coming from gas and from hydro. Now, we once had that system. Electricity was cheap. It isn't. And we're all paying, and some people are paying with their jobs. Some farmers are now losing their productive capability because they're getting these massive new power lines put over their properties to bring renewable energy from somewhere out in the donga into the cities, and they can't operate equipment underneath those power lines. So they've lost acreage and they've lost areas which produce food. This is an absolute travesty. A lot of the votes are in the areas around the edge of cities and in semi-rural areas. Mr Dutton should think callously and think, I want to chase the traditional Labor vote, and these people are being destroyed by Labor policies. Why should we have the Libs as a Labor light, which currently they are?
Well, we've seen that.
Rita's got a hand up.
We've seen that political realignment in the US. We've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in Australia. The Liberal Party seems to be the last bunch of people to know that there has been a switch. Those inner city affluent areas are going left, and the working middle class are increasingly going right. What about the argument they may put forward? Well, we don't need to leave Paris. We can still have these net zero targets because we'll get there via nuclear. What's your response to that?
Well, that argument is invalid because nuclear is going to take a long time. The second thing is you can leave Paris very, very easily. It's no difficulty at all. And the third thing is we have to think as a punter. And the punter gets an absolute shock when they look at their electricity bill. The quicker you can bring that down, the better. The more coal we can put into the system, the better. We have coal-fired power stations. They are discriminated against because they're black, and we shouldn't have that sort of discrimination, as we're told. And so we are actually destroying systems which can provide us with cheap 24/7 power and making it very expensive. It can be done